The night did not begin with explosions. It began with sirens, with that rising metallic wail that turns entire cities into collections of held breaths. Then came the fire. Ballistic missiles slammed into central Tel Aviv, and in the chaos that followed, the images were immediate and brutal. Flashes cutting through the dark, vehicles burning in the streets, black smoke lifting over packed neighborhoods, and rescue crews racing toward places where ordinary life had been ripped open in seconds. Reports from the ground described damaged buildings, cratered roads, shattered windows, and families pulled from apartments that, only moments earlier, had still felt safe. In one of the most haunting details to emerge, a full missile, not merely debris, reportedly landed near an apartment block, carving out a massive crater and killing a caregiver who did not reach shelter in time. The destruction was not abstract. It was physical, intimate, and close enough to touch. As the scale of the damage became clearer, the human toll began to take shape as well. Emergency services said people had been killed and wounded over successive days of strikes, while municipal officials and local media described dozens of buildings damaged in a single night. Firefighters moved from one scorched vehicle to the next. Search teams checked rubble, stairwells, corridors, and parking areas. In dense urban neighborhoods, even one missile can transform an ordinary block into a landscape of shock, noise, and dust. Here, there were multiple impacts, and with each one came the same terrifying pattern: the warning, the countdown, the hope that interception systems would work, and the sickening realization that at least some had not. What followed was not simply a military exchange, it was also an information war, a battle over meaning, justification, and narrative. Iranian officials presented the attacks as part of a far larger campaign, describing a sweeping operation involving missiles, drones, and strikes on strategic targets linked to Israel and the United States. They claimed that dozens of major locations and hundreds of military-related points had been hit in the span of just 2 days, and they framed the operation as proof that their forces had broken through enemy defenses and surpassed previous military achievements. Those claims, vast in scope and dramatic in tone, moved quickly through Iranian state media, which portrayed the campaign as both retaliation and demonstration, a message not only to Israel, but to Washington, Gulf states, and the wider international community. Iranian media also circulated claims of attacks on major American-linked systems in the Gulf, including what was described as a high-value early warning radar installation with enormous strategic reach. No immediate confirmation followed from the United States, but in conflicts like this, public claims are often designed for more than factual record. They are signals. They tell domestic audiences that their government is acting forcefully. They tell adversaries that escalation remains possible. And they tell the region that the battlefield may not remain confined to one country or one front. Then came one of the most striking elements of the response, a senior Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson appearing not at a formal podium, but from what state media described as a school hit by airstrikes. The setting itself was part of the argument. The message was simple and forceful. Iran wanted the world to see itself not merely as a state conducting military operations, but as a nation under attack, wounded in its schools, hospitals, media institutions, and civilian spaces. The spokesperson described the ongoing military campaign in highly charged terms, portraying it as a comprehensive, multi-layered operation against American and Israeli military objectives, while also accusing the other side of targeting Iranian civilians and public infrastructure. It was the language of wartime righteousness, heavy with sacrifice, duty, grievance, and divine legitimacy. That rhetoric matters because wars are fought on 2 levels at once. One is the level of missiles, radars, launch sites, and shelters. The other is the level of legitimacy. Each side tries to persuade the world and its own people that it is acting lawfully, defensively, necessarily. Iran's message was that its strikes were not expressions of hostility toward neighboring populations, but responses to aggression, directed at the sources of attacks on Iranian territory. Officials insisted this was consistent with the principles of self-defense under international law. They were careful to draw a line between the governments and military bases they said they were targeting and the broader nations of the region. Whether that distinction holds in practice is another matter entirely, especially in a region where military assets are often embedded in politically sensitive territory and where any strike risks widening the circle of war. The emotional force of Iran's public statements also drew from images of loss inside Iran. Officials and spokespeople referred to attacks on children, schools, hospitals, stadiums, and workplaces. They spoke of civilians killed, families buried, public institutions bombed, and a country being asked to endure war while also being lectured by the same powers it accused of fueling it. Their argument was not subtle. If the world could see damaged neighborhoods in Tel Aviv and respond with alarm, then it should also see damaged neighborhoods in Iran and understand the depth of Iranian rage. In this telling, the war was not just about strategy or deterrence, it was about humiliation, memory, and the refusal to absorb violence silently. At the same time, Iranian officials used the moment to attack what they described as the hypocrisy of international diplomacy. They accused Western governments, especially those that regularly invoke human rights and the rule of law, of failing to act when Iran was attacked. They questioned the relevance of the United Nations system, suggesting that international humanitarian law had become meaningless when powerful states or their allies could act without consequence. These accusations were aimed not only at governments but at institutions. The UN Secretary General, the Security Council, and the broader machinery of international order. The implication was stark. If the rules do not restrain war now, then perhaps they never truly did. That critique blended with another line of Iranian argument, that the conflict had been fueled by deliberate deception, especially around the nuclear issue. Officials rejected claims that Iran was on the brink of producing the material needed for a nuclear weapon, arguing that such warnings were part of a broader pattern of falsehood used to justify aggression. They pointed to prior attacks on nuclear-related sites and asked how a country could be described as both militarily crippled and simultaneously one step away from a strategic breakthrough. In their telling, diplomacy had become theater, and public claims from Washington were being used less to prevent war than to rationalize it after the fact. But beyond the speeches, the official declarations, and the attempts to define the conflict morally, the reality remained brutally concrete. A missile that lands near an apartment building does not care about legal doctrine. A child in a shelter does not experience war as a debate over proportionality. A hospital under strain does not feel the elegance of geopolitical theory. Across the region, ordinary civilians once again found themselves trapped inside calculations made by governments, generals, and intelligence services. Sirens become routine. Shelters become part of the architecture of daily life. Parents count seconds between warning and impact. Journalists rush towards smoke. Rescue crews become witnesses to history whether they want to be or not. And the deeper fear behind all of this is not only the violence that has already happened, but the violence that may come next. Because once missiles cross borders repeatedly, once public rhetoric hardens into absolutist language, and once each side begins speaking not about de-escalation but about endurance and total resolve, the conflict develops its own momentum. Every strike becomes an argument for another strike. Every funeral becomes a political event. Every televised image becomes evidence, accusation, recruitment, and memory at once. The danger is no longer limited to one city or even one pair of enemies. It spreads outward, toward U.S. bases, shipping lanes, allied militias, neighboring capitals, and fragile governments that may be pulled into a war they did not choose but can no longer avoid. That is why some of the most urgent language in Iran's public messaging was aimed at the international community. Officials argued that the world still had a choice to make before the conflict expanded beyond control. They said the Security Council had the power to act if it truly wished to, and that the real barrier was not law or process, but political will. Whether one accepts that framing or not, it points to a central truth of the moment. Once a regional war crosses enough lines, diplomacy becomes harder, not because peace is impossible, but because war creates its own justifications faster than negotiators can contain them. So what remains after the sirens and the fire? A city damaged, families grieving, leaders speaking in absolutes, a region once again staring at the possibility that limited retaliation may be giving way to something wider and far more dangerous. In Tel Aviv, the images of burning streets and broken buildings now stand beside the language of resolve from Tehran. In Iran, officials insist that what the world is seeing is only the consequence of aggression met with resistance. And between those positions stands the same unanswered question that shadows every escalation in the Middle East. Who still has both the power and the will to stop this before the next wave arrives? For now, the smoke over damaged neighborhoods, the rescue lights flashing against broken concrete, and the relentless certainty in official statements all point in the same direction. This is no longer just a warning shot, no longer just a symbolic exchange meant to save face. It is a confrontation that has entered a far more dangerous phase, where each side believes it must prove not only strength, but endurance. And in wars like these, endurance is often measured not by speeches, but by how much suffering a nation is willing to absorb before it finally says enough.